Welcome.
Thank you so much, dear Khalid, and welcome everybody. I am very happy to deliver this guest lecture to you because I had the opportunity to think about what is the legacy of classic interlinguistics in the the process of language construction, and I will define that in a bit. Thanks to an invitation I received from the organizers of a conference, international conference, Orléans, about language construction, and so I can now reflect over it again and present all the things to you. So without further ado, I will start now, and then you will have space for questions, comments, remarks, and so on. What are constructed languages? What are we talking about? So constructed languages are languages that are made up in writing. So until recent times, as a classic by John Lyons, Introduction of Interlinguistics book declares, which I already referred in a paper in 2017, until recent times, most of the societies were illiterate. So languages were only spoken. Nowadays, there are more or less 7,000 living languages across the world. Only half of them, more or less, have a stable writing system. Languages normally are spoken before to be written, if even so. There are, on the other hand, two exceptions: sign languages, which are languages that by definition are not spoken but signed. And there are many. So we have Lingua dei segni italiana, we have Netherlands gebarentaal, one is from Italy, the other is from the Netherlands. And the mapping of the sign languages is different from the mapping of the spoken languages. For example, there is no relation, typological relation between sign language of the Netherlands and Flemish language. So on Belgium, they are completely different, unlike the spoken languages, which are varieties of the same language. So it's a very interesting word. But today we are talking about the second exception, which are constructed languages, and discipline dealing with that is called interlinguistics. So already Ferdinand de Saussure, the founding father of modern linguistics, in 1916 course on general linguistic book, mentioned Esperanto 3 times, and exactly saying that the life of a constructed language is different, because you have a project phase on the left before the primitive contract. What is the primitive contract? It is that mutual agreement that the community of speakers or users of a language share in order to be understood one to the other. And this primitive contract is completely implicit in the case of natural languages, while it is explicit in the case of constructed languages. Because by the moment in which the language is published, no more reforms are possible for free. Something happens, and the language starts its semiological life. So this is the expression that Ferdinand de Saussure noticed already more than 1 century ago. So what is this life cycle of languages? You have a continuum of variation normally, so languages that are spoken, and then with the language planning process, you define a standard variety. Sorry for the typo here, the origin was in French. Standard variety, which means that you decide how to write it, the writing system, and then the normative lexicon, and so on. And then this, of course, influences language use, which influences the variation, and so on. So this is the cycle. In the case of constructed languages, the starting point is not a continuum of variation, but is the standard variety. You start with the standard variety, which is completely on the table as a project. So it's not living. So the consequence is that for constructed languages, the big challenge is oracy. So they start to be written, and then if they are successful, they are also spoken. So constructed languages violate the universal property of languages of priority of speech, with these exceptions that I already mentioned before. They may be adopted by supporters forming a community of practice. And this is the code. So, community of practice identifies a social grouping not in virtue of shared abstract characteristics, for example, class, gender, or simple co-presence, example, neighborhood, workplace, but in virtue of shared practice. Think about a community identifying itself through a church. They go to the service, so they participate to the service in the church, and then they talk about the mission of the church and so on. So there are always two levels: the object level, which is the practice per se, and the meta level, the reflection over the practice. And this is how the community is formed. Another example is chess players. Chess players identify themselves because they play chess. So the object level is the practice of chess playing, so they play chess. And then when they stop playing, they talk about chess. And this is the meta level. Why this is different from other forms of human grouping? Because if you are a chess player, it doesn't matter your social class. It doesn't matter your gender preferences. It doesn't matter where do you live, where do you work, where are you from, what is written in your passport. All that matters is that you play chess. The big shift of the concept of communities of practice from sociology to social linguistics is that the practice is a language. It's not something else. And this changes things, let's say, in quite a remarkable way. Why? Because all languages have a double nature. They are bridges and they are walls. Why I say so? Because languages are ways to communicate, all languages. So they are bridges to make contact with other people. But on the other hand, languages define a space, that is the metaphor of the wall, a space of identity. We are different from you. There is us, there are them. Us is the people who speak the language and they belong to it, and the others are the people who do not speak the language. So, depending on the language, depending on the situation, there is more emphasis in the bridge aspect or the wall aspect. But both contradicting natures, so it's kind of oxymoron, which means an unsolvable paradox, is there all the time. So, interlinguistics is the discipline dealing, the branch of linguistics dealing with constructed languages. So traditionally, Detlef Blanke, for example, who has been one of the most influent scholar in interlinguistics of the past century, defined in one of his latest publications, 2004, an overview of the literature. This Interlinguistics and Esperanto Studies part of the scholar literature already more than 20 years ago. He says that interlinguistics is the study of the optimization of the national linguistic communication. And then he defines planned languages or interlanguages as these languages like Esperanto that are planned, constructed, invented to be a neutral, ethnically, nationally neutral way of talking between people belonging to different backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, linguistic backgrounds, and repertoire. Blanke defined a scale, which then he refined, he elaborated in a second version, and then after his passing, I had to adapt it in order to be applied to the situation in this century, because the pervasiveness, the fact that the digital life we live is so great in our lives, that I had to revise his scale. And in a nutshell, we have three main steps. The first step is when the language is published, it becomes a language project. And it depends on the language author or conlanger, if you prefer. Most of constructed languages are language projects because they are just there. And they can be published in full, which means they are exoteric or public. What does it mean? You publish not only the text in the language, but you publish also the key to access the text. So the grammar and at least bilingual dictionary to access. Or it can be esoteric, and so that means that a secret, you just publish the text and the text is immersed in a piece of art, for example, a fantasy novel, and then you can have a glance, and the joy is to understand what is there without an explicit explanation of the language itself. Few of them, and when I mean few, I mean a dozen, become awakening languages. Step 2, what Blanke has called Semi-Plansprachen auf Deutsch in German, semi-languages, semi-planned languages, which is terrible. And so I prefer to say awakening languages, so languages that wake up. And we have some examples here, IALA of Interlingua of the International Auxiliary Language Association, as traditional rivals of Esperanto, and then I can also add Klingon, Navi, maybe Dothraki and Tokipona, which are languages that are not meant for international communication, but are meant either for a form of art, expression, Hollywood, like Klingon for Star Trek, Navi for Avatar, Dothraki, the most famous language of the Game of Thrones universe, and Tokipona, which is a philosophical language that is used to have a positive meaning of life. And in this case, why they are awakening? Because there is a community of practice forming around it. And then they have an organization with regular congresses, and they start using the language in writing and in speech, mainly online, but not only, because they also meet in person. So this is the second stage. Thousands of language projects, more or less 12 awakening languages. And then there is only one language that reaches the third stage, which is full-fledged language, which is Esperanto, has more than 1,000 participants in congresses. It has even family speakers, now 5 generations, and it is used in different domains with distinctive subgroups. So there is, the language is large enough to have developed subgroups, identities, for example, LGBTQ, or specialized language for domain for scientific use in linguistics, in astronomy, in chemistry, or something like that. So this is my taxonomy of languages. There are many of them, as you can see. So they can be used for general use or specific use. And the general use means that they are meant mainly for international communication and used generally in the real world. And this is the big group of international auxiliary languages, Esperanto and its rivals. Maybe because we are speaking mainly to public of Bosnia and Herzegovina, maybe you have heard about Interslavic, which is a kind of a common language for people with Slavic heritage. So you speak Interslavic, you learn Interslavic, and you can be understood by all people speaking Slavic languages. This is the idea, which is nice both for people not having original Slavic heritage, but also for people having a Slavic heritage. And then we have a small group of logical languages like Lojban and Linkos, which are based on different principles, so a formal logic that is applied to the real world, not only to the world of abstract thinking. And then these are, of course, public languages because you have published also at the disposal for the public. You have also the grammar, exemplary texts with parallel translations and dictionaries. Then you have on the other side here Hollywood languages, Navik, Klingon, and Dothraki being the big threes, but also the Neo-Tolkienian languages, which means the languages based on Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and Hobbit and all the fictional world of Middle Earth, but reinterpreted for Hollywood. So from the trilogy of Peter Jackson and the others. And for that, they have to, let's say, carve the languages in a coherent way, because Tolkien's never published original grammars of, for example, Sindari or Kenya, the most important Elvish talks. It was not, they were not meant to be used by humans. So they were secret. That's why you see this dotted arrow. The other dotted arrow is about the strange case of Volapük, which was the first language, auxiliary language, which succeeded to form a community of practice, but it was superseded by Esperanto quickly. And then it became a language for literature use, especially, but not only in Esperanto literature, as a language of distance. So as we say in English, it's Greek to me. In Italian, we say per me è arabo, it's Arabic to me, literally, and so on. You cannot say that in Esperanto because you get offended the Greek or the Arabic people. And so you say, tio estas Volapükaĵo, this is Volapük to me, which, funnily enough, comes from Danish, because in Danish we have the same expression. This is visualization of the languages, constructed languages, according to their publicity on the horizontal axis and according to their purpose on the vertical axis. And we can say that these dotted lines mean that at the end of the day, what happens is that the language author conlanger has an idea, a purpose for the language, but that does not mean that the community of practice uses the languages that are proposed by the language inventors exactly how they were meant to be. What does it mean? For example, Tolkien never thought about his languages for films, and then what it happens that is this derivation. The founder of Volapük never had thought about using the language for just literature, fiction, or so on, and that was what happened. So this means that once you have the primitive contract, as Ferdinand Saussure said, we have seen that before, settled, the primitive contract settled, the language author loses control. That means that the language, the constructed language, is the property, so to speak, of the community of practice. So who use the languages are the people who have the destiny of the languages in their hands. So of course, if you think about the combination of the two parameters, secrecy, publicity on one side, and the purpose on the other side, it's obvious that you cannot have a language for being used generally by the people which is secret. So that's why this is void. So let's now go to the second section, having defined our objects of analysis. Interlinguistics under historical perspective, because I have the main purpose of this talk is to show how classic interlinguistics can teach us something. So what does it mean, classic interlinguistics? That's why we have to go for a historical perspective. So we have a work in progress since 1903 of interlinguistics as a discipline. And the first thing that was made by Louis Couturat, actually, one of the founding fathers of the discipline, a philosopher, mathematician, logician, and language author himself, a Frenchman, was to give dignity to the discipline, saying, we are standing on the shoulders of giants. So before us, there were people like Leibniz, John Wilkins, George Dalgarno, Jan Amos Comenius, who already dreamt about um, universal language. And I use this term carefully because they didn't think about international languages, the philosophers at the time, but something that is more abstract and more general, kind of logic with semantics. And this is the idea. So Comenius, Czech founding father of pedagogy. John Wilkins, with his real characters, founding father of the taxonomy that was then picked up by Linnaeus for biology, and Leibniz, founding father of mathematics, along with Descartes and Newton. So, important people, of course. And you can see between parentheses the year 1900 because Louis Couturat himself published a critical edition of unpublished work by Gottlieb Leibniz. So we have two Leibniz, the original one and then the rediscovered one with new things. And the new thing is that he had an idea of simplification of Latin in order to avoid the scientific bubble, to quote a very pregnant expression by Michael Gordon, a historian from Princeton, who has published a book called The Scientific Bubble, because this is what happened after the fall of Latin in the scientific revolution. So, in order to differentiate from the science based on Aristotle and the Greeks, which was not based on mathematics, the new scientists like Copernicus, like Galileo Galilei, Newton, Descartes, Leibniz, and so on, started to write in the national languages. Galileo wrote mainly in Italian, not only, but mainly. Newton also in English, and Descartes in French. And Leibniz said, well, we should stay with Latin, be loyal to Latin, but we can simplify it because Latin is complex. But this idea that he had was not published, so maybe he was not convinced completely, and it was rediscovered only by the end of the 19th century and the early days of the 20th century. So, of course, this raised attention, and the first definition of interlinguistics comes from a small publication that is saved in the Österreichische Nationalbibliothek, the Austrian National Library, which has a section which is Esperanto Museum, and was called A New Science, Une Science Nouvelle. And he said, well, we can call this idea of trying to optimize international communication. So from here to Detlef Blanke was always the same, meaning that we have to find the auxiliary common languages. That was the first definition, which we overcome, including also languages with different purposes from international communication, as we have seen before. Then the popularization of the term was the reprise of the term by Otto Jespersen in the Third International Congress of Linguistics in 1931, without any substantial difference. And at the time, what was the point? At the time, there was no one de facto international language for science. There were at least three. So French, German, and English, and that depends on the discipline. For example, chemistry was in German, philosophy in French, business and economics in English. But there were new results in other languages like Danish, Russian, Japanese, Italian, and so on. And so that made the work of the scientists difficult because you have to have proficiency to understand the other languages, at least at the reading level. So you should be able to read results about your discipline in Russian or Japanese. And this is something that was difficult for the time, because if you are a scientist and you are dealing with a discipline like astronomy, you don't have the time to study Russian and Japanese. And so they say, why not to have a common language to publish our results? That was the idea at the time. But was already late, yes, but in 1931. Most probably yes, because most of the, let's say, proposals that were published were already there. Volapük was published in 1879, and was the language author was Johann Schleyer, a German Catholic priest who thought that the language was given by God. Then Esperanto, which superseded Volapük, was published in 1887 by Ludwig Leger-Zamenhof. And then were Giuseppe Peano, a mathematician from Turin, very famous because of the Peano axiom. Peano axioms that can transform arithmetics in logic. Published Latino Sineflexione, reprising Leibniz's idea in 1903, and then Louis Couture published its own reform of Esperanto in 1907. So maybe it was already late. And in fact, what was happening in these years after the First World War were the so-called interlinguistic wars. So a lot of debate about what is the best proposal. And we have Occidental by order of Edgar de Waal. Jespersen himself proposed Novial. And then later came out Charles Ogden's Basic English. Charles Ogden is the founding father of semiotics. And then the very latest rival of Esperanto came just after the end of the Second World War in the US, mainly done by Alexander Konitz, called Interlingua. The classic period of interlinguistics comes from 1879, the year of publication of Volapük, until 1951, the publication of Interlingua. So this is the period that we are seeing. What happens afterwards? Interlinguistics gets out of fashion, something very old-fashioned like this historical card about Esperanto in 1910. You see, it's very modern with this Zeppelin. Of course, it's not modern anymore, so it has this kind of nostalgic feeling. In a sense, yes. And it started a long winter. This is a term that I use, mutuated from the history of artificial intelligence. There was a long winter of artificial intelligence from 1952 until 1993, and I will explain why. There is long winter. No, not many proposals come out. One was this Neo by Arturo Alfandari, who was an Italian-Belgian diplomat who has published his proposal already in 1937, but it was completely neglected. But he published again in 1961, but did not have any substantial appreciation. And then in the 80s, there are a couple of two different languages. They are not rivals of Esperanto, so not for international communication. La Adam by Suzette Haden-Egg in 1982 was meant to be a language for feminists. Women should have a language of their own, a secret language against the men. And she invented this language, and this language has some morphemes to indicate emotional states that are linked to the cycle of women. It's really an interesting thing. It was meant to be used by feminists, but feminists at the time, this wave, and even later, didn't pick up language, so she used the language then for a science fiction novel called Native Talk. Most importantly, in 1984, it came out Klingon, which was made by Mark Okrand under a commission of Paramount Pictures, which is the owner of the Star Trek universe. And that was done just as a gift to the fans, the Trekkies. Why? Because Trekkies complained about the quality of the Klingon language in the films, and I mean the films in the theaters, so the movies, long movies, not the episodes and TV series. And so for the Star Trek 3, the third film, they said, well, let's construct a language for that. They could not expect that language would be used for cosplay, which was a new phenomenon at the time in the US in the 80s. Cosplaying was invented in Japan in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and came as a mass phenomenon in the 80s in the US. And then this meant that by the end, Klingon has a double, let's say, life, the life into the fictional world, the diegetic life in the fun world, which means that you use that also to talk not only about Star Trek things, but also about your normal life. So what happens is that why 1993? In 1993, the World Wide Web started to become spread. So it's the digital revolution for the masses, and this gave the new spring of interlinguistics, and especially after the publication of Google search engine in 1998 and the turning point of the new millennium. You maybe do not remember the millennium bug fear we had in 2000 turning, because there was this box that computers could not anymore work. Of course, it didn't happen. And then Sonia Lang published Okipona, and David Salo, the Neo-Sindarin, Peter from Navi, and David J. Peters Dothraki. So 2009 is a very important year for the story of constructed languages. And you can see that these languages are not meant as rivals of Esperanto. In the original proposal by Sonia Lang, she even says Tokipona is not a rival of Esperanto, just not to have Esperantists against the language. And that was a very good move, because by the end, Tokipona was adopted by Esperantists too as a language to play with. This is the periodization of interlinguistics. We will now focus on the classic interlinguistics, so about the arrivals of Esperanto and Esperanto, 1879 until 1951, and we see what we can learn. Lesson 1. Volapük was the language given by God. You can see this very serious portrait of Johann Schleyer with the book of Volapük, because he dreamt that the language itself. And what happened is a kind of a small Kulturkampf, which is a German term. By the end of the 19th century, Germany was unified by Otto von Bismarck, the Second Reich, and that was problematic for the Catholics, because you can see that there is kind of a chess game between Otto von Bismarck and the Pope at the time. Are the German Catholics more loyal to the Emperor, or more loyal to the Pope, in a sense, like in the Middle Ages? Who is more important? Because the Pope was very anti-modernist, so he didn't accept reading newspapers, taking trains, and so on for the Catholics, while, of course, Bismarck wanted to modernize the country. And Schleyer was an anti-modernist, was loyal to the Pope, and was put in prison because of that. And then he reproposed in a small scale the same thing in the community of practice of Volapük, because he didn't want to accept any change of the language, while Kerkshoff, a Dutch gentleman educated in France, wanted the language not to be only to be in contact with the highest spheres, but also for via commercial language, for example, language for diplomacy. And that was against Schleyer's will. And so by the end, the community was split. So lesson 1 is, after language is published, it is not possible to touch its structure for free. If you want to change the structure, what is the structure? The pronouns, the verbal system, prepositions, and so on, not just the lexicon. You cannot do that for free. Because if you do that, most probably you split the community in two. And if the community is small, you risk to kill the language, in a sense. So lesson 2 and 3 come from Esperanto. We can see here a postcard of 1909, Amica in saluto, in friendly greetings. And this is Hope, is a goddess. And she is dressed in green, which is the color of hope. And she writes Esperanto, an Esperantist, and lists Esperantists there in the book, and has this green star with 5 points, like an aura, and let's say in the Christian iconography. You can see people from all over the world. You can see that from the dresses. You can see traditional dresses from Spain here, for example, or from native nations in Americas. and so on, and from Asia, Japanese, Chinese, and so on, they are connected by Esperanto. So this is the idea. Esperanto is for all. It has an internal idea. The internal ideo, which means in Esperanto internal idea, is that everybody is welcome into the Esperanto community, regardless of its social characteristics, class, gender, birthplace, and so on. So this is the thing. So what is important is your attitude, openness, and respect of others, and openness to other cultures. So that could form an original culture that lives today, from the Belle Epoque to nowadays. And this is, for example, a meme in Esperanto. There is nice production of memes in Esperanto, which is, of course, an adaptation of Flower Thrower of Bansky. Parolo Esperanton speak Esperanto, and instead of throwing the flowers, it throws the green star, which is the symbol of Esperanto. So you can have, according to the period, different visualization, interpretation, and cultural artifacts into the Esperanto culture. Lesson 2 is that if you systematically and for a long time construct languages, create an original culture. So the motto that a language cannot exist without a culture is true even for constructed languages. If a constructed language is not only a project, but it becomes a full-fledged language, it creates an original culture. Because if you have a community of practice, the community of practice constructs not only the language, but constructs the walls, the identity. So even if the whole, let's say, discourse is Esperanto as a bridge all the time, which is true, but on the other hand, it's also a wall, because if you don't know the language, you are not belonging to the community. Can you enter the community? Of course, but you have to learn the language. That's the point. And yeah, of course, Esperanto influenced also other linguists like Lucien Tenier and its structural syntax. So you can always use Esperanto as a way to, let's say, build other things, and metaphor, whatever. This is just an example. For example, Tolkien was also influenced by Esperanto in carving his own languages, the Elvish languages, for example, and so on. And this is described in a beautiful essay about language invention, which is called The Secret Vice. Why I wanted to mention these two examples, because if you want to invent a new language, you should know the structural features of Esperanto, either to be inspired by them or to on the contrary, to avoid them. You cannot ignore Esperanto. Esperanto is so influential in the sense that once you have a newspaper article about a constructed language, whatever constructed language, there will be a small mention of Esperanto as the example of the most famous constructed language ever. So if you design a language project, you have to think about Esperanto in order to avoid similarities, if you want to avoid them, or to be inspired explicitly. Otherwise, you seem too amateurish. So, is there any limit of the freedom in invention, in language construction? It is. One of the limitations in freedom is exactly in the existence of famous constructed languages like Esperanto. Lesson 4, Peano and his Latino Sineflexione, also Interlingua, he focused only on, you see, academia pro Interlingua, to academic people. He addressed mathematicians and so on, thinking that the main thing is to conquer, let's say, the scientific community. And by the end, he said that he was in this very depressed in this letter in Italian. I will not translate that for you, but just to say that the linguistics is just as gardening is just a hobby. So this means that even the most serious people who are developing a language project have fun in that. So there is always an element of joy and an element of being a hobby. So don't be shy. If you want to invent a language just for fun, do it, because everybody has done it before you. Lesson 5. With Louis Couturat and his Esperanto amélioré, improved Esperanto. Couturat only went to the intellectuals, and this is the report of the committee which was a committee of people from academia to accept the best version of these proposals, and this is very serious, but you can't consider too much the role of intellectuals in the diffusion of constructed language. So you need intellectuals to say it's a serious thing, it's well made. But on the other hand, you have to understand that it's not enough to have intellectuals by your side in order to build up a community of practice. Community of practice should have some intellectuals who defend it, but should have people who do the real work, in a sense, on the language. Lesson 6, Edgar de Waal and his Occidental. Edgar de Waal was participating to Volapük before, then Esperanto and so on, so he could publish his proposal well before he went, and then he published that later, after the First World War, after the foundation of the League of Nations in Geneva into 1920-21. And by the end, I have to say that he hesitated too much, because if he were publishing that before, maybe the history could be a bit different, because combination of English and French, because this is Occidental, terrible name by the end, especially for our nowadays sensibility, because of course very colonialist, but by the time it could have some relevance. So don't be perfectionist. If you want to publish your language, publish it, even if it's not perfect, because not of these languages is perfect. They have some flaw, and you can discover it only via the community. Lesson 7, Jespersen and his Novial, in his autobiography, written in Danish and then translated in English, he said that there was a lot of discussion in the Association of International Auxiliary Language, but the results were rather meager. What is the point? He tried to involve all the people together, tried to please all the people together, and he tried to have, let's say, a friendly relation with the Waal. These are the two versions of the language which are very similar, Novial and Occidental. But by the end, if you want to please everybody, the risk is that you please nobody. So you want your language to be appreciated by everybody. By the end, it is neglected. This is what happened to Novial. So take your stance, decide what you want, and be prepared that some people will like it and some people will. Lesson 8, finally, Interlingua. So Interlingua was sold by Alexander Gold in 1954 as a constructed language without construction. So the international language exists, it need not to be constructed, it simply need to be recovered. Well, this is simply a trick. He even said that it's not mine, it's a committee and so on, but by the end it's one person who decides all the time. There is no shame in constructing a language. Construct is a good thing. Interlingua was sold as a constructed language which is not constructed, was of course fishy for the people and say there is something not good here. And that was also one of the elements why the language, despite some financial support, was not very successful. In conclusion, in order from Volapük to Interlingua, we can say that if you want to publish a language today, it's very improbable that you can have a big success like Esperanto, but you can think about how to build up a culture. So be prepared on that. So phraseology, proverbs, and so on can be, let's say, at least prepared. Don't hesitate too much, and take your stance and decide your identity of your language, because the language is a wall and a bridge at the same time. And it cannot be a completely neutral language in a complete objective way. It's impossible to respect 7,000 living languages, not to mention the dead languages, so it's impossible simply. And say that your language is constructed. Don't be shy on it.